It's a culmination of 2 great weeks in New York, a great fundraiser for the International Tennis Hall of Fame to recognize what the International Tennis Hall of Fame is all about. The history of our game has been built by all these great players that have played from around the world. And so the 50th anniversary of Open Tennis was one of the biggest days in the game.
Let's be honest, we wouldn't know the stories such as we've heard tonight and we can see up at the Tennis Hall of Fame if we didn't have some wonderful chroniclers of this sport. Some journalists who really cover this, who tell us what's going on, but also cause us to think more deeply about the sport, about what it is and what it can be. And that leads us right to our last award of the evening. It is, of course, the Gene Scott Award. He was a legendary chronicler of the sport, and every year we give an award to someone who has really made a huge difference in the sport in the way they report it. And that's no exception this year. This individual has made a very, very big difference. And here to give the award is actually Gene Scott's widow, as well as the former New York Times sports editor.
I know my late husband, Gene, would be so excited and proud that a member of the media is being honored tonight. Christopher Clarey of the New York Times embodies Gene's ability to explore a story deeply, to draw readers in with the rare talent of someone who excels with the written word, and to truly showcase the remarkable stories of personalities and moments in sport that might otherwise go unnoticed without his watchful eye. Gene would be gratified that a person with a shared commitment to print journalism receive this award tonight. And I know he'd be thrilled that his former colleague and one of the sports world's great writers, George Vesey, is here to present it. George?
Well, it's nice to be here tonight. I'd like to start off by talking about Gene Scott. I came up at Newsday back in the 60s on Long Island. So one of the people we wrote about all the time was a local, Gene Scott of St. James. And he was so approachable, such a nice guy. Every time he did well in a tournament, a Davis Cup or whatever it was, and came back to Long Island, they would send one of us out there. And I found him to be a teacher and a nice fellow. And it carried over to when I was working, when I traveled, became a tennis writer and going to Wimbledon. Gene Scott, you couldn't have a better person for the award. I would say the same thing for Chris Clary. Getting the award, Chris Clary knows the exotic corners of tennis. He knows everything about tennis, every spare inch. And I'll give you an example. On one rainy, nasty morning at Wimbledon, about 20, 25 years ago, Chris came up to me and said, I know this great viewpoint, this crow's nest, where you can see 8 or 9 courts at once. I thought, wow, this is really obscure. And he took me off somewhere in the back courts, and then sure enough, there was a tower. You had to go up steps, but the last 15 steps were up a ladder, outdoors. What was it, Chris, 50, 100 feet above the ground? And I'm thinking, I'm carrying a laptop in my shoulder bag. I have a raincoat. I'm not ready for climbing. And I'm thinking, this man is trying to kill me. But no, really, he was educating me about tennis. It was a great view. When we got up there, we could see the courts. We could see people trying to get out there to play if the rain held off. And I learned something from him. I learned something from him all the time that he was working. He comes by his tennis knowledge as a player. He was the #1 in his class, in his team at Williams. And he has followed the sport. It's been his major sport. He's gone everywhere. As a journalist, I admire the way he has traveled and found not just the big stories, but the stories that show where tennis is from. In asking him about some of his greatest thrills in tennis, he mentioned a first-round Davis Cup match between Togo and Iceland. I don't know how that came out, but that's where Chris was, because he wanted to show that these nations care about tennis also. He has lived a very peripatetic life. He's moved all around the world for his tennis. Lives part of the year in France and family home there. He lives part of the year in New England. One year he even moved the family to Sevilla so they could learn how to speak Spanish. I mean, that's the way they roll in that family. In fact, tonight, Virginie was saying that my wife, about 20 years ago, we had dinner in Paris, and my wife said, this is what it's going to be like for you as the wife of a traveling sports writer. And I said, how did it work out? And she said, pretty much as your wife said, meaning goods and bads, you're away a lot. And Chris was, but he was chasing the stories. He knew where sports were played, and he covered other things as well. I'm going to read this to you. As global sports writer and tennis columnist, he not only covered tennis, of course, but he covered 9 track and field world championships, 14 Olympics, 10 Ryder Cups of golf, 20 British Opens, 5 American Cups of sailing. And then one time only, he went slumming. He covered a Super Bowl. And everybody's got to have an off moment. Plus, he covered 5 World Cups of soccer, which is one of my favorite sports, and 2 of them France won the World Cup. So it was an extra fillip for someone who loves that country as much as he does. As a soccer writer, Chris was driving across South Africa in 2010, leaving one stadium in the middle of the night to drive to the next city for something the next afternoon, and he ran into a dead horse on the highway and lived to tell the tale. Maybe he'll tell you about that. Well, we have a lot of hazards. It's not just covering wars that's dangerous for reporters. It's also covering World Cups and things like that. Chris also dabbles, and he'll talk about the tennis, but I just want to tell you about his life as a tour guide. In 1998, my wife and I were in France, and I was going to cover 2 matches in Marseille. And Chris said, no, the place to stay is in Aix, but only if you stay in this converted monastery, but you have to ask for room chambre 32, because that's the one with the view of the bell tower and the balcony. So, merci, Chris. You know it all. He's been everywhere. His worldview, his talent for observing and writing, his passion for tennis has informed and entertained a generation plus of readers. I cannot think of a more deserving writer to receive the Eugene L. Scott Award than my friend, my hero, Chris Clarey.
George has been my role model in chief since my earliest days in this crazy business of ours. It's for the way you write and also for the way you treat people. So thanks for being here tonight. It means a lot to me. And I also, of course, want to thank the Hall of Fame, and I want to thank Todd Martin in particular, because Todd and I actually started out together in a way. My very first French Open that I covered way back in 1991 was also Todd's first French Open in the main draw. And unlike me, he got to the 4th round. And he got there despite having to put up with all my rookie, long-winded questions that I was asking him all along the way. And Todd also is still, I've been doing this for 30 years, he's the only guy I've ever interviewed while he was getting massaged. True story. Prague, 1996, Davis Cup. And Todd decided to do it in the back room there, and I think he was pretty comfortable, a lot more than I was, actually. So Todd, thanks very much, and to the Hall of Fame, thanks very much. And above all, I want to thank you for allowing me the great privilege and rare honor of leaving the U.S. Open press room at a reasonable hour. That doesn't happen very often. Usually I close the place down, and usually the writing starts just about now. Nobody knows that better than my wife. Little did she know what she was getting into. About summer of 1985, a French exchange student from Paris walked into my parents' front door as a visitor, and she didn't speak a whole lot of English. And I didn't speak much French at all, I can tell you that, after slacking off in French class all through high school. But here we are, 33 years later, with our 3 French-American daughters, of whom we're so proud. Toscan, Savine, and Baril. And here we are 33 years later with a lot of stamps in our passports and a lot of memories. And Vesey, I couldn't have done it without you. There's no chance. I could have chased everything around the world, chased this sport, this great sport, and covered so many things without your patience and your understanding and your forbearance. So many deadlines, so many changed plans, so many late nights, and so much distracted living. It's a very modern term, but it's applied for a while. And I just want to say in French, merci beaucoup and je t'aime. And I'm so glad you walked through that door. I'm also really grateful to tennis, which was brought to me by my mother and my grandmother, who were both passionate players and, above all, passionate tennis fans. My house during Grand Slams when I was growing up was just people yelling at the television. You know, it was either Chrissy or Martina or whoever it was something going on. Always that kind of thing. So it's actually been really nice as a journalist to go to the slams myself and get that kind of peace and quiet actually watching the matches. My grandmother, who I called Nana, was particularly fanatical about tennis. Every year, on December 21st, she would send out 2 birthday presents well ahead of time. One was to her beloved and only grandson, that was me. And the other one was to a different Chris, that was Chris Everett. And I'm still not sure, which Chris my Nana loved more, actually, after all this time. But Nana wanted to make me a tennis champion, so she spent the money on the coaching and the training. I think we even had a fitness coach for a little while when I was young. And here I am, I'm a tennis writer. So it didn't quite work out as she planned, but I did play, as George mentioned. I played junior tennis when I was in Hawaii. I played high school tennis in San Diego. I played college tennis when it wasn't snowing at Williams College in the Berkshire Mountains. And I won a few matches. I lost a lot more. But I think I realized from playing, the main realization was that how hard it was under pressure to hit the kind of shots that the great players can hit and make look so easy. This was absolutely no help to me whatsoever when I was playing tennis. Quite the contrary, actually. But it's been a great help as a tennis writer, because I've always tried. I think the most important thing when you're a tennis writer is to have a critical eye and be objective about what you see. But I think it's also been very helpful to me to remember how hard this game can be under pressure, how tough it can be when the nerves spark up. And I've always tried to remember that when I write and have a bit of empathy, even though I've never been in a stadium with 23,000 people. When Todd told me I got this award, I went back and looked at people who'd won it before, and it's quite a list. A lot of great champions and a lot of wonderful commentators like Dick Enberg and Mary Carrillo. I was really touched that they chose to honor the Hall chose to honor a print journalist this time. A regular, bona fide, unglamorous print journalist. But the award's named for Gene Scott, after all. And Gene is somebody who wore a lot of hats in tennis. But from what I've heard, I think he really valued the hat that he wore when he was writing about tennis the most. And so, that means a lot. We didn't have a long-standing relationship. We only talked a couple of different times. But I felt like he really understood the game. And for me, it's been a real pleasure to follow his work in Tennis Week and places like that. The problem is, what Gene loves to do and what I love to do with writing about tennis and writing in general, it's an imperiled thing. There's a lot of trouble in journalism, a lot of trouble in tennis writing. There are fewer and fewer publications who are willing to send reporters around the world to write about tennis, fewer and fewer full-time tennis writers. If you look at that big bustling press room in the US Open, which looks so full and vibrant, a lot of those people are freelancers just scraping to get by. The other issue, I think, is the way the world is changing in terms of communication. A Twitter message or an Instagram post that can take 1 or 2 seconds to make, several seconds, can often generate more buzz than a big detailed article where people have spent a long time trying to research and report very objectively, take weeks or months. And that's a problem, I think, for our society in general. But I also feel like, for me, Journalism, it's being there. It's being there, looking in people's eyes, having those interviews face to face. It's watching the match courtside, not from your computer. And that, to me, is what it's all about. So I want to thank the people that have allowed me to do that through the years, and try to be a constructive critic. That's my goal. So I want to thank, first of all, some of the players, past and present, and I want to thank some of the administrators and the coaches who've taken the time, even though it wasn't always terribly convenient, to answer my questions or my phone calls. Some of you are here tonight. I want to thank my first bosses in the business, Barry Lords in San Diego, the late, great Barry Lords, Neil Amder, who was my first sports editor at the New York Times, and both Barry and Neil were former tennis writers, so that was why they supported so much covering the game of tennis. I want to thank our tennis editor, who's not here tonight because of Serena's situation, Nyla Jean Myers, one of the best editors I've worked with, and I also want to thank the institution that I work for, the New York Times, for trying to spend the money and the resources to get the story right, anonymously or otherwise. And as some has alluded to tonight, it's a tough time in tennis too. It doesn't look that way when you watch it and you see these great stars that are still thriving, the Nadals and the Federers and the Djokovic's and the Serenas. The Grand Slams are thriving. There's a buzz. I've been covering the slams since 1990, and you can see the growth and the explosion of interest in those venues. It's remarkable. And yet, behind the scenes, and Cliff Drysdale, who I can see from here, would remember this very well from his days with the ATP in those critical years, there's a great deal of division right now. I've been covering the game for 30 years. This is one of the worst turf wars that I've seen. And I just feel strongly that in a situation where there is so much competition around the world for entertainment, so much competition for people's hearts and minds and screens, that the last thing tennis needs right now is division and confusion. What it really, really needs is cooperation and compromise and a shared vision of where the sport needs to go, one that people can understand and follow easily, not need a master's degree to understand in terms of where the points come from. So I wish that for tennis, and I also feel we're at a critical stage with the sport right now, with the change of generations that's going to come in both the men's and women's game at the top. I think tennis needs to look at itself and be very honest about what makes it special and what makes it unique. And for me, call me old school, and this is going to be a big topic tomorrow morning in your newspapers and websites and everything else. I believe that tennis is still best served by its champions and would-be champions walking out on those big courts alone, facing each other as individuals, trying to take on their own demons, their own desires, their own dreams, and face those down themselves without a coach coming on the court to try to help them out. I'm sure if Gene Scott were with us tonight, he would have made a bunch of these points, probably way ahead of me. But I appreciate the chance to honor his spirit by mentioning them here. And I also want to finish up on this special night for my family and friends. On table 11, come see us afterward. And I want to make a couple toasts to two things that I hold dear. The first, I don't have a glass, but symbolic, is to truly independent, unfettered journalism. So a toast to that. And another toast to tennis. It's a grand old game. And both those things to me are worth fighting for. So I thank you, and good night.